The night had settled over the wide stretch of land in a quiet way, the kind of quiet that makes the air feel heavier than usual, as if it is holding back a secret. Inside a small, worn-down farmhouse stood a man who had never known ease yet carried a gentle steadiness that made people trust him without needing many words. Most folks in town barely noticed him when he passed by, except for the feed store owner who often wondered how a man with so little managed to keep so much heart. What they didn't know was that, behind the cracked walls and flickering lamps of his house, lived a world he tried to protect at any cost. That night, as the wind brushed across the fields, he knelt beside two small foals lying on old blankets near the kitchen stove. Their coats were thin, their ribs showing under rough skin, but their eyes held that soft, trembling spark that made him believe they had a chance. He had pulled them from a ditch earlier that evening after hearing faint crying while walking home. Most people would have left them there, calling it nature's way, but he couldn't do that. He'd never been able to turn his back on something small and helpless, no matter how empty his pockets were. The foals shivered while he worked quietly, warming a pot of milk and humming under his breath. His place was not meant for animals. Boards were loose, the roof leaked on certain nights, and the rooms were too narrow for anything other than a simple life. But it didn't matter. Over the years he had rescued more creatures than he could count. Some stayed for days, some for months, and a few never left. People called him stubborn or foolish for taking in so many animals when he barely had enough for himself, but he didn't pay them much mind. He always believed that kindness made a home stronger, not weaker. Tonight felt different, though, and he didn't know why. Something in the air made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way the breeze shifted suddenly or the way the foals twitched, looking toward the window as if something outside was watching. He turned his head, listening. The wind usually came with a steady whistle between the barn boards, but now it sounded broken, interrupted by something heavier. He walked toward the door and peered out through the small gap near the latch. Moonlight spilled across the yard, revealing nothing unusual. The old barn leaned toward the east the way it always did, and the fence stood crooked from years of hard storms. The fields were quiet, yet something still felt wrong. He had lived long enough to trust those feelings, the kind that crawled up the spine without a sound. When he returned to the foals, he felt the floor tremble slightly. It was faint, so faint he almost convinced himself it was his imagination. But the tremble came again, then again, like distant steps growing closer. The foals lifted their heads, ears flicking. He placed a steady hand on them, whispering soft words he hoped would calm them, though he could feel his own nerves tightening. He moved to the window again. This time the night no longer looked still. Shadows shifted near the tree line. At first he thought it was only branches swaying, but then he saw something move in a way branches never could. A dark shape, large, fast. The shape paused, lifting its head, and he felt the air thicken in his chest. He didn't need a closer look to know it was a horse. A wild one. The wild horses rarely came close to houses. They roamed free across the land, untamed and proud, keeping distance from human scent. He admired them from afar, always wishing he had the strength and freedom they carried in their stride. Yet seeing one so near, so bold, sent a jolt through him. Something must have driven it down from the hills. Hunger, fear, or something he couldn't name. As he watched, the horse stepped out of the shadows. Its coat shimmered under the moonlight, muscles sharp and alert. This was no ordinary wild horse. It moved with intensity, almost restless. It tossed its head, snorting sharply as if warning the night itself, then its eyes fixed on the house. The man stepped back from the window. He moved to bolt the door, though he knew a wild horse wouldn't normally come inside. He had seen strange behavior in animals before, but nothing that hinted at this kind of boldness. The tremors in the ground grew stronger. The foals cried softly. He crouched beside them again, brushing a hand over their heads. Their tiny bodies pressed close to him, seeking warmth and safety. He whispered calm words, hoping the wild horse would pass, hoping whatever force had unsettled it would fade before it reached the house. But the trembling steps grew louder. Then a loud thud hit the side of the house. The walls shook, dust falling from the beams. The foals jumped. The man grabbed one of the oil lamps, turning its small flame higher. Another forceful thud followed, then a scraping sound along the wall, like hooves sliding against wood. He rose slowly, heart beating hard. He walked to the door again and pressed his ear against it. He heard breathing outside, heavy breathing, sharp expulsions of air, close enough to fog through the cracks of the doorframe. The man swallowed, trying to understand what drove the animal to act this way. Wild horses were powerful, but they were not usually aggressive without reason. He lifted his hand and slowly removed the latch, wanting to ease the tension rather than provoke it. He didn't plan to open the door wide, just enough to look out, enough to see what was troubling the creature. Before he could decide, a crash exploded through the quiet night. The door burst inward, crashing against the wall with a force that rattled the entire house. The lamp shook in his hand as the wild horse charged into the room, mane flying, hoofs slamming against the wooden floor with thunderous speed. The foals screamed. The man stumbled backward, raising the lamp higher so he could see. The wild horse filled the space like a storm, eyes wide, breath heaving, body trembling with something between fear and fury. It stopped only inches from him, towering over him, sweat glistening across its coat. He held still, the lamp shaking slightly. The wild horse pawed the ground, sending shards of old wood into the air. Its eyes darted to the foals, then back to him. Something in its posture hinted at desperation rather than threat, but the fear in the room was thick enough to taste. He whispered gently, hoping his voice could cut through the panic circling the horse's mind. The wild creature snorted hard, head swinging, muscles tightening like wound rope. One wrong movement, one wrong sound, and the small house could fall apart under its weight. The foals cried again, drawing the horse's attention. The man stepped slightly to shield them, though he knew he could not physically stop an animal of that size. He didn't want the situation to turn dangerous for them or for the horse. For a moment, everything stood frozen. The air, the dust, the trembling floor, even the flame of the lamp seemed to steady itself. The horse stared at the man with a force that felt almost human. Something was being asked or explained without a single word. Before he could make sense of it, the horse suddenly jerked its head toward the open doorway behind it. A sound echoed outside, low and distant, something approaching the house in the darkness, something that had chased the horse here, something that made this wild creature break through a door it never would have touched under normal circumstances. The man turned his head slowly toward the doorway, listening. The wild horse stepped closer to him, as if urging him to pay attention, as if it knew the danger outside was far greater than what it had just done inside. And as the sound outside grew heavier, clearer, more unsettling with each breath, he realized the night was not done testing him. Something else was coming toward the house, something that made even a wild horse seek shelter. The man kept his breath steady as the wild horse stood in the center of his kitchen, muscles shaking under the lantern's glow. The sound outside grew louder, rolling across the yard like a warning wrapped in wind. He tried to listen carefully, but the pounding in his chest kept drowning pieces of it. He didn't know if it was another animal or something stirred up in the night that had chased the wild horse straight into his home. Either way, he knew he had to stay grounded. Panicking would only make things worse for the foals and the frantic creature standing inches from him. The horse's sides rose and fell in sharp waves, each breath cutting through the small room. Its ears pinned back and then shot forward, trying to judge the threat outside. The man reached slowly toward the stove, not to grab anything but to keep himself upright. The floor felt like it shifted with every heartbeat. The foals pressed against the blanket, trying to hide their small heads under each other. He wished he could shield them better, but the wild horse was unpredictable, and the danger outside still pressed forward. He lowered his voice and spoke softly, hoping the gentle sound would calm the horse even a little. He often used the same tone with newborn calves or stray animals he found near town. His voice carried a mix of tiredness and patience, the kind that came from years of working alone and caring deeply in quiet ways. The horse flicked an ear, but it stayed restless, its hooves scraping lightly against the floor. He could feel the weight of its fear vibrating through the boards. To make sense of what was happening, he forced himself to think back to earlier that day. He had walked farther than usual to gather feed because his usual supplier had run short. On the way home, he passed the lower fields where he first heard the crying from the ditch. That was where he found the foals. They were barely able to move, tangled in a mess of weeds and mud. He remembered the fear in their eyes and the way they tried to nuzzle each other for comfort. He wrapped them in his coat and carried them the rest of the way, even though the weight dragged on his tired shoulders. At the time, he thought maybe the herd had moved on without them or something scared the adult horses away. He didn't think much beyond that. But now, looking at the wild horse in his house, he wondered if whatever chased this creature had already been stirring trouble earlier that afternoon. Maybe the foals were abandoned because the herd had fled in a rush. Maybe something powerful enough to frighten a wild herd had swept through the land. He rubbed his thumb across the handle of the lamp, steadying himself as another thump echoed outside. It didn't sound like hooves this time. It was heavier, dragging across the ground, like something trying to push through the dirt. The wild horse lifted its head and stared at the doorway with open fear. The man felt a chill crawl up his spine, but he refused to let it freeze him in place. He slowly backed toward the window and glanced outside. The moon shone bright enough to paint the yard in pale light. At first he saw nothing but the beaten fence and the dark stretch of field. Then he noticed a shape far out by the barn. A large shape, too large for a person, too low for a horse. It moved slowly, shifting from side to side like it was testing the ground. He couldn't make out clear details, only the outline of something disturbed and restless. The wild horse stomped once, warning him that whatever was outside was closer than the window showed. He stepped away and returned to the foals, whispering again to ease their trembling. He needed a plan. The lamp gave light, but not enough to make the wild creature calm completely. The door stood broken, wide open, leaving them exposed. The only barrier between the strange presence outside and the small lives inside the house was the wild horse itself, though the animal was already in a panic. He took a slow breath and tried to remember the last time he saw something threaten this land. Years ago, a pack of wolves had drifted down from the hills during a cold winter, searching for food. They had taken a few sheep from neighboring farms, but their presence was brief. The man knew the sound of wolves, though, and what he heard outside was nothing like that. He recognized the rhythm of wolves, the way their feet hit the ground. This was different, heavy, unfamiliar. The wild horse shifted again, lifting a hoof as if ready to strike at whatever threatened them. The man studied the creature's body language. Wild horses rarely sought shelter unless forced into a corner. This one had burst through a door to escape something. That alone meant the danger outside was not ordinary. He reached for the pitcher of water on the counter, not because he was thirsty, but because he needed something stable in his hands. His thoughts kept circling the same question. What had driven a wild horse into his house? Before he could settle his mind, another sound broke the night. Not dragging this time, not stomping. It was a loud snap like a branch breaking under massive weight. The horse jolted, its body stiffening. The foals whimpered. The man closed his hand around the pitcher and tried to think quickly. He knew he couldn't fight off whatever was outside. He didn't own weapons, nor did he believe in using them unless he had absolutely no choice. His strength came from patience and understanding, not force. But patience alone would not keep the foals or the wild horse safe. He looked around the room, searching for anything that might help. His eyes landed on the old wooden board he used to keep the back room closed in winter. It was thick and sturdy. Quietly, he crossed the room, easing past the horse without sudden movement. He didn't want to startle it. The horse watched him closely, but did not interfere. He lifted the board and carried it near the broken doorway, pressing it gently against the frame to see how well it could block the opening. It wasn't perfect, but it offered some sense of boundary between the inside and the outside. The wild horse stepped closer and stood beside him, breathing heavily as if trying to strengthen the barrier by presence alone. The man whispered another calm word and began adjusting the board to fit better. Before he could secure it, the strange shape outside let out a low, rumbling sound that made the wild horse rear slightly, hooves striking the floor. The man grabbed the horse's neck instinctively, steadying it. For a brief second, they shared a moment of fear that felt strangely united. It wasn't him protecting the creature. It wasn't the creature protecting him. It was both of them bracing against something neither understood. When the horse settled, he managed to wedge the board more firmly in place. It wouldn't hold long if the thing outside decided to charge, but it would slow down whatever was coming. The lamp flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the walls. He returned to the foals and knelt down. They nudged him weakly, still shaking. He stroked their small necks and tried to think clearly. If the strange presence outside had chased the wild horse here, then the foals might be tied to this as well. He wondered if the herd had sensed danger earlier and fled, leaving the smallest behind because they couldn't keep up. The thought made his chest tighten. He had always believed animals could sense danger before people. Maybe he had ignored signs that the land had been trying to warn him. The wind shifted again, blowing through the broken doorway and bringing the scent of earth and dry grass. It didn't smell normal, though. There was something sharp mixed in. Something unsettling. He couldn't name it, but it made the air feel heavier. The wild horse suddenly turned its head toward the window, ears forward, body rigid. The man followed its gaze. Across the yard, near the barn, the large shape moved again. This time it lifted a portion of its body higher, revealing a tall, curved form that cast a strange silhouette against the moonlit ground. His breath caught. Whatever it was not a creature he recognized. He felt an instinctive fear pulse through him, the kind that urged him to protect everything small and fragile in the house. He didn't move, though. He stayed low beside the foals, trusting that silence might keep them unnoticed. The wild horse let out a low grunt, not loud enough to challenge, but enough to warn. The shape outside responded by shifting again, inching closer to the house. The man could hear its weight pressing into the earth now, slow and deliberate. He knew the night was far from over. Whatever had come down from the hills had not given up. And the wild horse, with everything it had done to reach safety, now stood inside his home, waiting for his next move. The land had changed in a single night. The safety he once relied on felt thinner than ever. And as the strange shape paused at the edge of his yard, he understood that he was facing something he had never imagined. He braced himself, unsure whether the next sound would be the creature retreating or approaching his door with force. The tension held like a rope drawn tight. The night waited. The night around the farmhouse grew even quieter after the foals settled. Yet something tense still hung in the air, as if the land itself knew trouble wasn't finished. The farmer tried to calm himself by keeping his hands busy. He moved between the small barn and the house, checking the young foals every few minutes. Whenever he passed through the doorway, he glanced toward the dark hills rising behind his land. There was a pressure in his chest, not fear exactly, but the uneasy sense that the wild horse roaming those hills had not forgotten the path it carved in its frantic escape. The scratches on the doorframe, the scattered hay, and the dented bucket were reminders of that brief, violent appearance. He didn't know if the horse meant harm or had simply been desperate, but its sudden intrusion had changed everything. By morning, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee, staring at the streak of light creeping across the horizon. He barely slept, yet he didn't feel tired. His mind stayed fixed on the strange bond forming between his quiet farmhouse and the wild world outside it. The foals, still shaken, leaned close to him whenever he passed by, as if sensing he was the one thread holding their small world together. He wasn't used to being needed this way. His life had always been simple work and simple routines, but now he had become a guardian whether he wanted to or not. As the sun rose, he took the foals to the open yard to let them stretch. Their legs were thin, still trembling from the scare they had lived through, but they leaned against each other for stability. He watched them with steady patience, giving them space yet staying close. He felt connected to them in a way he couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was because they, too, were trying to survive with so little. Maybe it was because saving them gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since he was young. A few hours later, a neighbor showed up on horseback, a man who rarely came unless something important was happening. He slowed his horse near the fence line and called out, asking if everything was all right. The farmer didn't mention the wild horse crashing into his home, but he asked casually if anyone nearby had seen unusual movement or heard strange noises. The neighbor shook his head, though he mentioned hearing restless sounds out on the ridge during the night. He said it might have been a predator, some unsettled animal, but his tone suggested uncertainty. The farmer nodded, pretending it was nothing. He didn't want anyone worrying or thinking he was losing control of his land. But after the neighbor left, he stood still for a long moment, looking at the hills again. The wild horse was still out there. He could feel it. Days passed with the tension growing instead of fading. The foals adjusted slowly, beginning to trust their new environment, nudging the farmer whenever they felt brave enough to wander a little farther from the barn. They slept huddled together at night, and sometimes he sat outside their stall, listening to their quiet breathing. They grounded him, pushed him to care more than he had in years. But strange things started happening. Hoofprints appeared around the yard, deeper and larger than any made by the foals. Some mornings, the farmer found the gate nudged open just an inch, though the latch was always secured the night before. Once, he saw a faint silhouette on the far ridge at dusk, a shape standing perfectly still, watching. The light was too low to make out details, but the size and posture could only belong to the wild horse. Instead of fear, he felt a strange pull. The wild horse wasn't behaving like a predator or a threat. It almost seemed as if it was searching for something. Maybe even trying to understand what had happened the night it burst through his door. Still, the unpredictability kept him on edge. He couldn't risk another sudden break-in. The foals were too fragile. He strengthened the fences, added boards to the doorframe, and kept a lantern lit by the window at night. Even then, he found himself waking at the slightest sound, half expecting the thunder of hooves to slam against the walls again. The tension seeped into everything, stretching long into the evenings and making the wind sound like whispered warnings. One afternoon, while repairing a loose fence post, he spotted marks on a tree at the edge of his land. Deep, fresh scratches, higher than any normal horse could reach. He touched the bark, feeling how rough the grooves were. The wild horse was stronger than he realized. Maybe angrier than he wished to believe. Or maybe just misunderstood. He couldn't decide which scared him more. When he returned to the house, the foals rushed to him as if sensing his worry. They nudged at his arms and clung to him, their small voices soft but urgent. He knelt beside them, rubbing their necks, trying to calm them even as his own heart pounded. Something was shifting. The wild horse was coming closer, not running away. That night he couldn't bring himself to lie down. He sat by the window with the lantern glowing dimly beside him, watching the open fields. The air felt heavy, stirring only when a restless breeze brushed against the walls of the house. The foals inside the small stall shifted and sighed, their unease leaking through the quiet. Hours dragged by, midnight passed, then another hour. He was close to drifting into a half-sleep when a sound cut through the silence. A single sharp crack of a stick snapping in the dark. He stood instantly. The lantern flickered as he lifted it, casting long shadows across the room. The sound came again, slower this time, like deliberate steps brushing through dry leaves. He moved to the door, opening it just enough to look outside. His breath caught when he saw it. The wild horse stood near the barn, its coat shimmering under the thin moonlight. Its eyes reflected something deep and conflicted, nothing like the wild aggression he expected. It wasn't charging or stomping. It was simply standing there, breathing heavy, as if exhausted or unsure. The farmer didn't step out. He stayed inside the doorway with the lantern raised, waiting. The wild horse stared back, its ears flicking at each small sound. Then it took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not fearful, just steady. Another step followed. The ground beneath its hooves barely made a sound. It stopped a short distance from the house, head lowered, muscles tensed as though holding back from a decision it wasn't certain how to make. The foals inside stirred again, their call soft and uneasy. The wild horse reacted instantly, its ears shifting toward their voices, its breath deepening. The farmer didn't know if it meant danger or something else entirely. Every instinct told him not to move too quickly. Whatever this moment was, it was fragile. He whispered into the night, telling the wild horse he wasn't there to harm it, that the foals were safe, that nothing would happen to them. His voice didn't shake, but his hands did. The wild horse took one final step forward, coming close enough that he could see the scars along its side, old wounds mixed with fresh ones. Its chest rose and fell rapidly. It looked torn between breaking into the house again or turning back to the safety of the hills. The world felt suspended, the night holding its breath, the fields silent and waiting. The farmer's heart thudded hard as he kept his eyes on the wild horse, unsure what it wanted, unsure what would happen next. And then, in one slow movement, the wild horse turned its head toward the open fields, pausing as if listening to something only it could hear. Its body tightened, ready to move. The farmer didn't know if this meant danger was coming or if a choice had just been made. He only knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next was going to change everything. The wild horse stood motionless near the edge of the field, its dark shape outlined by the faint moonlight that slipped through the drifting clouds. The farmer didn't dare step forward or retreat. He simply held the lantern steady, breathing carefully as if even the sound of his breath might break whatever thin thread held this moment together. The foals shifted restlessly behind him inside the house, their soft calls creating a strange, trembling harmony with the wind brushing through the grass. The air felt heavier than ever, loaded with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite understanding either. The wild horse's ears twitched at each small sound, especially the foals. It lifted its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it tested the air, searching for something the farmer suspected he couldn't fully understand. He noticed a faint limp in the horse's stance, a slight favoring of one leg. It wasn't obvious at first, but now that he was watching closer, he saw how the muscles in its flank tightened whenever it shifted weight. This creature wasn't just lost or wild. It was hurt, maybe starving, maybe cornered by the recent storms that had swept across the region. Or maybe something else had driven it down from the hills. The farmer whispered again, voice steady but low, telling the horse he wasn't trying to trap it, that he wasn't a threat, that the foals were safe and nothing more. The wild horse only stared back with eyes that held something fierce but also confused. There was intelligence in that gaze, a rare kind of awareness that made the farmer feel as if the animal was weighing every word he spoke. Slowly, the horse turned its head toward the barn. Its breath quickened as it listened to the foals again. It took a small step forward, then hesitated, pawing lightly at the dirt. The farmer felt his chest tighten. The horse wasn't deciding whether to attack or flee. It was deciding whether to approach the very place it had violently broken into before. The place where the foals now slept? The wind rose suddenly, sweeping through the trees and carrying the scent of distant rain. The horse lifted its head sharply, alarm flashing through its posture. Then, without warning, it spun around and galloped across the field, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. The farmer watched until the sound of hooves faded into silence. Only then did he lower the lantern, his hand trembling slightly. He secured the door again and checked on the foals, who huddled close to him with nervous energy. He soothed them with quiet touches, but his mind remained tangled in the moment that had just passed. Something was wrong. The wild horse wasn't acting like a creature wandering aimlessly. It was being pushed or followed, its behavior unpredictable and tense. The scratches on the trees, the limp, the marks near the fence, it all pointed to more than simple wild instinct. As he tried to rest that night, his thoughts churned. He had always believed that nature followed a rhythm he could predict if he paid close enough attention. But now it felt like the rhythm had broken, leaving only fragments that didn't fit together. The land wasn't calm. The animals weren't calm. Even the air felt different. Morning came with a dull gray sky and heavy clouds that promised rain. The foals were restless again, pacing the small yard and calling to each other. The farmer decided to keep them close to the house instead of letting them roam the wider pasture. He felt a protective edge sharpening inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just responsibility anymore. It was instinct. He repaired the fencing again, adding thicker beams where the wood had split. He worked with a determined pace, checking every corner of the yard for signs of intrusion. While walking along the far edge of the property, he froze when he spotted fresh tracks in the soft earth, not just the wild horse's tracks. There were others. Large hoof prints, deeper and spaced farther apart, suggesting something heavier. And beside them were marks that didn't belong to any horse. Longer impressions, almost claw-like, trailing along the grass as if something had been walking or dragging across the land. The farmer knelt beside the tracks, tracing the edges with his fingers, his pulse quickened. He didn't know what creature had made these marks, but it unsettled him. It meant the wild horse wasn't the only thing moving through the area. Something else was close. When he returned to the house, he kept silent about what he'd seen. He didn't have anyone to tell anyway. The foals followed him step by step, sensing his unease. The farmer tried to go about his day, but his attention stayed fixed on every distant sound: the creak of the trees, the shift of the wind, the soft thump of hooves from somewhere far beyond sight. By afternoon, the sky darkened further, and rain began to fall in slow, steady drops that tapped against the roof. The foals huddled under the covered area near the house, leaning against each other for warmth. The farmer sat on the porch with them, running his hand along their small necks. The storm seemed mild at first, but as the hours passed, the rain grew stronger, turning into sharp sheets that rattled against the windows. It wasn't long before thunder rolled across the hills. The farmer saw flashes of light in the distance, brief but bright enough to outline the trees against the sky. The foals pressed closer to him, their bodies shaking with each rumble. He spoke to them in calm tones, though even he felt the storm stirring something deep inside him, something like the tension before a breaking point. As the storm intensified, the farmer heard a distant cry echoing through the hills. It wasn't human. It wasn't quite the sound of a horse either. It carried desperation, fear, and something raw that made the hairs on his arms rise. He stood quickly, despite the pounding rain, peering into the darkness beyond the yard. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and for a split second he saw a figure racing across the ridge. A horse, but not the wild one. This one was bigger, heavier, and its movements were frantic, like it was fleeing something close behind. Before he could fully process the sight, the sky went dark again, and the thunder drowned every other sound. The foals called out in fear, and he rushed to them, guiding them inside the house. He barred the doors tightly, his breath uneven. Something was happening out there, something he couldn't name yet. But he felt it drawing closer with every crack of lightning. The storm raged deep into the night, and the farmer stayed awake, sitting near the door with a lantern beside him. Each time the wind howled, he imagined hooves pounding or trees splitting. Hours later, when the rain finally softened and the thunder rolled farther away, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Then, just as he started to rise, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the barn. The foals jerked up, panicked. The farmer grabbed the lantern and ran outside, not caring about the wet grass soaking his boots. He circled the barn, holding the light high. Another flash of lightning illuminated the yard. The wild horse stood near the broken fence, its coat drenched and its stance trembling. But it wasn't alone. On the ground near its hooves lay another horse, larger, badly injured, its body heaving with weak breaths. The wild horse lowered its head, touching the fallen horse gently, almost pleadingly, as if urging it to rise. The injured horse didn't respond. The farmer felt his stomach twist. The sight was heartbreaking, but there was something even more alarming in the wild horse's posture. Its eyes were wide, frantic, searching. It wasn't just mourning, it was warning him. He stepped closer, slow and careful, lantern held forward. The wild horse snapped its head toward him, not threatening, but urgently signaling something. The farmer paused, unsure of what the animal wanted or feared. Thunder echoed one last time in the distance, and the ground trembled beneath his feet, just slightly, enough to make him realize the injured horse hadn't collapsed from the storm. Something had chased it. Something powerful enough to wound a full-sized horse and drive the wild one to his doorstep again. The wind fell silent, the foals cried from inside the house. The farmer felt his chest tighten with dread. Whatever had driven those horses down from the hills was still out there. And it was getting closer. The farmer stood frozen in the rain-soaked yard, watching the wild horse stand guard over the injured one. The storm clouds drifted slowly apart, leaving behind patches of calm sky, but the air still carried that heavy tension that had been building for so long. The foals cried again from inside the house, and the farmer felt torn between helping the frightened little ones and trying to understand what the wild horse was trying to tell him. His lantern flickered in his hand as if it sensed the same deep uncertainty running through him. He took a breath and stepped closer. The wild horse didn't back away this time. It only shifted slightly, making room for him to kneel beside the injured horse. Up close, he could see long scratches across the horse's flank, cuts deeper than anything a simple fall or branch could cause. The animal's breathing was shallow and uneven. The farmer's hand hovered above its shoulder for a moment before he gently rested his palm on its warm coat. The wild horse released a soft sound, almost like relief, as if it trusted him to do whatever he could. He whispered calming words, not sure whether the horses understood the meaning or only the tone. Then he pressed his hand against the worst wound to slow the bleeding. The injured horse trembled but didn't resist. The wild horse stepped back and lowered its head, keeping watch on the dark field beyond the fence. Every so often it lifted its ears sharply, listening for something the farmer couldn't hear. The storm had passed, but the danger hadn't drifted away with it. As he worked to steady the injured horse's breathing, he thought about the strange tracks he had seen earlier, the claw-like trails and the way the earth had shifted under him when the thunder rolled. Whatever had been hunting these horses must have been driven down the hills by the storm. With its prey scattered and confused, it had come too close to his land. The idea of something powerful enough to terrify a full-sized horse made him shudder, but he forced himself to stay calm. Fear wouldn't help now. The animals needed him, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. After a long stretch of silence, the injured horse tried to rise, legs shaking beneath its weight. The farmer steadied it with his arms, murmuring encouragement. Slowly, with effort and pain, the horse pushed itself upright. The wild horse circled around it, brushing its head against its side, giving it the strength it needed to stay standing. The farmer stepped back, relieved to see the injured horse holding its weight, though barely. He guided both horses toward the barn where he had prepared a sheltered corner with hay and blankets. The injured one leaned heavily into the wild horse as they walked. Inside the barn, the farmer worked with steady hands, cleaning the wounds with warm water and binding them with strips of cloth he kept for emergencies. The wild horse stayed close the entire time, its breath warm and steady against his back. He didn't flinch from its presence anymore. Something had changed between them. The fear that once lived inside the animal's eyes had shifted into something else, something trusting. He stayed with them until the first light of dawn filtered in through the barn's wood panels. The injured horse slept quietly now, its chest rising and falling in slow, peaceful breaths. The wild horse stood nearby, finally letting its tense posture soften. The farmer nodded, satisfied with their progress, and went to check on the foals. They greeted him with relieved energy, nuzzling his hands and legs as if trying to draw comfort from him. He sat with them for a long moment, feeling grateful that they were safe. As the sun climbed higher, he returned to the field to inspect the land again. The strange tracks were still there, but they hadn't increased in number. Whatever creature had passed through seemed to have moved on after the storm. The earth felt calm again under his feet. Even the birds that had been silent the night before began to sing from the branches, their voices weaving through the early morning air. When he walked back to the barn, the wild horse came forward to meet him. Its eyes were clearer than he had ever seen them, no longer filled with the wild panic from earlier nights. It stepped closer and gently pressed its forehead against his shoulder. The farmer froze, taken aback by the sudden affection, then slowly lifted his hand to stroke the horse's neck. The moment felt like a quiet promise, a shared understanding that neither of them needed words for. Days passed with a steady rhythm. The injured horse grew stronger under the farmer's care, taking slow steps around the yard with the wild horse guiding it closely. The foals grew braver too, stepping outside more often and watching the older horses with curious eyes. The land seemed to settle into a gentle peace, as if the storm and the danger it brought had finally released its grip. One morning, the farmer opened the barn doors to let the horses enjoy the fresh air. The wild horse stood tall, its coat shining under the soft sunlight. Beside it, the once injured horse walked with a steadiness that showed it had almost fully recovered. The foals trotted around them in playful circles, nudging their legs and trying to mimic their movements. The farmer leaned against the fence, watching the scene with a mixture of pride and calm. He knew now that the wild horse had broken into his home not out of aggression, but out of desperation to protect the younger ones. It had sensed danger long before he had, and it had done everything it could to keep the foals safe. That realization deepened his respect for the animal. As the horses grazed peacefully, he noticed the wild horse glance toward the hills. Something in its posture told him it was thinking about returning to its roaming grounds. The farmer felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. He knew this day would come. Wild creatures didn't stay confined forever. But the thought of letting the horses go, especially after everything they had survived together, felt heavier than he expected. Later in the afternoon, the wild horse approached him again. It stood silently for a moment, then nudged his arm with a gentle firmness, as if urging him to follow. Curious, he walked with it to the edge of the field. From there, the hills stretched far in the distance, covered in green and gold. The injured horse joined them, standing tall despite its past wounds. The foals followed closely, sensing that something important was happening. He took a deep breath and spoke softly, telling the horses they were free to go if they chose. The wild horse lifted its head proudly, looking from him to the open horizon. The injured horse stepped closer to the wild one, brushing its head against its shoulder. The foal stayed quiet, waiting. After a long pause, the wild horse turned toward the hills and began to walk forward. The injured horse followed, strong enough to keep pace. The foals took hesitant steps after them, but then paused, looking back at the farmer. He smiled gently and knelt down, giving each one a soft touch before guiding them forward. With a final look, the foals ran to join the others. The farmer watched them move across the field until they reached the ridge, their figures outlined against the golden sky. The wild horse stopped and turned back one last time. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. The farmer felt a warm sense of calm settle over him. Then the horses vanished beyond the ridge, returning to the wild world that had shaped them. He stood alone in the quiet field, feeling not lost but something brighter. The land felt whole again, the danger gone, the balance restored. He walked back toward the house where the light in the windows glowed warmly. His footsteps felt steady, grounded. He had offered sanctuary when it was needed most, and in return the horses had given him something he hadn't expected: purpose, connection, and a renewed sense of peace. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky shifted into shades of soft pink and gold, the farmer stood on his porch and looked toward the horizon. The world felt wide and calm, and for the first time in a long while he felt completely at ease. The story of the wild horse, the foals, and the strange nights of danger would stay with him, a reminder that even in the quietest places, courage and kindness could change everything. And as the evening settled gently over the land, the farmer knew that his little home would always be a place where lost or wandering creatures could find shelter and safety. It was a comforting truth, one that warmed his heart as he stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him and allowing the peace of the night to wrap around him like a familiar blanket. The land was calm now. The danger had passed. And the horses, wherever they roamed, carried with them the memory of a man who chose compassion over fear, shaping a happy ending none of them would forget.